1985, Kevin O'Keefe was a 36-year-old outdoor enthusiast that lived in Sacramento, California. He loved being out in nature, going hiking and camping, and in fact, he had always wanted to go camping in Alaska. By the summer of 1985, Kevin was actually doing research on areas in Alaska that he could potentially go camping, and he settled on this area called Glacier Bay National Park, which even by Alaskan standards is particularly wild and totally remote. Kevin planned to go camping on his own, so he decided he would need to take a class on how to survive the Alaskan wilderness because he's going to be out there by himself and he's chosen this place that's incredibly rugged. So he actually enrolled and participated in a class teaching you how to go camping in Alaska. Then on September 20th of 1985, he flew from Sacramento to Juneau, Alaska, where he commuted his way up to Glacier Bay National Park. When he arrived at the park's headquarters, he went up and introduced himself to the park rangers that were working there. He told them he'd be over near the Wolf Point area, which was an area right against the water, and he said he was going to be here for about 3 weeks. He planned on leaving on October 10th. So everybody who works there is aware that there's this guy, Kevin O'Keefe, who's going to be by himself for almost 3 weeks camping near the water. No one in Kevin's family or any of the park rangers heard from Kevin for the next couple of weeks. But the whole point of this trip was basically to escape reality and go live in nature for a few weeks, so no one's raising any red flags. A few weeks later, on October 8th, which is 2 days before Kevin said he was planning to leave the park, which he told park rangers and they knew he was there, a couple of park rangers were in a boat patrolling some waterways around Wolf Point, which is the area where Kevin was camping. The rangers decided to take a bit of a detour to get inside of Wolf Point and actually check in on Kevin and just see how he was doing, because they knew he was out here by himself. They're making their way down, and as they turned this last corner where they could finally see Kevin's sight, immediately they knew something was wrong. The first thing they noticed was Kevin's tent was not in the area that it was supposed to be in. There was kind of a designated spot on the soil where you'd place your tent, but his tent was actually down a few meters on this beach that butted up against his campsite, and some of his gear was outside of his tent. Not strewn everywhere, but outside of his tent, like you had placed it outside. As they're looking at his tent, they realized that the top strut that kind of held the top of the tent together was folded down. It looked like it had broken right in the middle. They called out for Kevin, he was nowhere around, and they kind of rationalized what they saw. They thought, he's leaving in a couple of days. My guess is he's probably preparing his campsite for an exit. Maybe he went out to, go on a day hike or something. I'm sure everything is fine. So they leave and come back the next day just to double check. And when they arrive, there's been no change. The tent is still sitting down on the beach with that strut collapsed. His gear is sitting outside of his tent like a sleeping bag and sleeping pad. It's clear that Kevin has not been to this campsite since the last time they saw him, which was 24 hours earlier. So now they're outright concerned and they decide to launch a search for Kevin. They began flying little airplanes over the area where Kevin's campsite was and the surrounding areas. No sign of Kevin. They brought ground searchers with dogs onto his campsite. They're looking everywhere. No sign of Kevin, but they did discover at his campsite that virtually all of the equipment you would expect to be at a campsite in Alaska of someone who's staying there for a few weeks, well, it was all there. He had his backpack fully packed as if he was going to go on a hike. It had food, it had extra clothes and water. It was all packed right up against a tree. All of his sleeping equipment and his cooking equipment. And oddly, there was lots of food that Kevin still had left at his campsite that was out in the open, and no animals had touched it, which is a complete anomaly. As they began searching the outer areas of his campsite, dogs were able to locate Kevin's boots, his glove liner, and his hat. They were tucked away in this gully about a half-mile away from this campsite. That they were not visible to the naked eye. It took dogs finding it to locate these items. After finding these items, the early speculation was it looks like Kevin was attacked by bears or some other predator. But the park rangers, who knew this area extremely well and had seen other bear attacks, said, I don't think this is a bear attack because there's no sign of a death struggle anywhere at his camp. If you get attacked by a big predator, you're going to fight for your life to save yourself. You're going to grab onto things and flail around. It's fairly obvious, and there's none of that. There's also no blood or remains or any indication that someone was hurt in this space. And if an animal had come into this camp and attacked Kevin and eaten Kevin, they certainly would have taken the food that was out and about in the campsite. But none of the food was touched. As the investigation continued, rangers would say how strange it was that no wild animals are coming into this campsite. There's no activity. There's nothing in the area. It's like the animals are staying away from Kevin's campsite. When they couldn't find any sign of Kevin, the investigators went to speak with Kevin's family and asked them, did he have any signs that he was looking to end his own life? Do you have any information you can give us about him? And they said, no, he was really happy, well-adjusted, excited about this trip. He had taken a class to prepare himself for this trip. He told us that he planned on taking a couple day hikes, but no overnights. And he had no plans to meet other people while he was there. He was just looking to be on his own in nature. But after just a few days, they had to call the search off because there was no sign of this guy. He was just gone. Knowing that all of Kevin's gear was still located at his campsite means he did not leave to go on one of those day hikes that he had told his family that he might be going on. Because going into the wilds of Alaska without your gear is a death sentence. So Kevin must have been at his campsite when something horrible happened to him. But we know it wasn't an animal attack because there was no sign of that and no animals were coming near this campsite. So if it wasn't an animal attack, then what was it that caused his tent to shift down to the beach and have his gear strewn about on the sand and have his boots and glove liner and hat be located a half-mile away in some gully? And where's Kevin? In 2000, Patrick Whalen was 33 years old, and he was described as being an outdoor enthusiast, bordering on full-blown survivalist. He had hiked thousands of miles across the Pacific Crest Trail and had spent hundreds of hours camping inside of national parks, in particular the Glacier National Park in Montana. That was his absolute favorite place to go. In fact, he spent so much time there that the park rangers recognized him and knew him by name. On November 2nd, 2000, Pat was driving in Kiowa Junction in Montana when he hit a deer. Witnesses say that he stopped his truck, he got out, walked over to the deer, pulled it to the side of the road, took a pillow out of his truck, put it under the deer's head, and then he went and got food from his truck and put it near the deer's mouth, and then he just walked away. He abandons his truck. It's unclear whether his truck was not operational at this point or if he was just abandoning his truck, but either way, his truck would get towed the next day. 6 months after the deer incident, Patrick's father called the park rangers at the Glacier National Park in Montana, and he said, "I haven't heard from my son in months, and I'm worried about him. I can't get in touch with him. If there was one place he would be, it would be at your park. Have you seen him?" The park rangers, who again, they all knew Pat, they said, "We haven't seen him, but we'll keep an eye out for him." A couple of weeks later, 2 of these park rangers are out on a routine patrol through the park when they come across a very odd scene. They saw this blue tent sitting in the middle of this campsite. There's no one around it, and the middle strut that held the tent together was collapsed. They yelled out to see if anybody was inside the tent to make sure everything was okay, but no one calls back. They walk over to the tent itself, and they can tell that this tent has been out here for some time. It looks very weathered and sun-bleached, but there's no tears in the fabric, and all of the zippers are shut. When they opened up the tent, there was no one inside, but there were all the things you would expect to find inside of a tent at a campsite. Water, food, stove, boots, clothes, it's all in there. But again, the tent is collapsed, and based on the pattern of sun bleaching on the outside, it had been collapsed for some time. When the park rangers filed their report about what they found, they noted that it was really odd that no animals had ransacked this tent, because clearly it had been sitting here unoccupied for a while and there was food in the tent, but no animals had touched it. Authorities show up and they begin searching the area for Pat. There's no sign of him. They bring out cadaver sniffing dogs. They don't pick up any scent. One of the issues they were up against was they had no idea how long it had been since he had arrived here and then subsequently disappeared, because they actually went to the tow yard where he had had his truck towed following hitting that deer 6 months earlier, and his truck was still sitting in the tow lot. So he hadn't claimed his truck. That was 6 months earlier, and here we are, and there's this tent in the middle of the woods, and we have no idea where he is. But the most interesting and terrifying thing that was discovered was inside of his tent, there was an empty buck knife case. So the sheath was there, no knife. David Paulides offers a very interesting theory about why it was there. He suggests that while Patrick was living at this campsite, he must have been in his tent one night and he hears something outside of his tent that apparently was formidable enough that he felt the need to take his knife out and go out into the open to confront it. He gets out. The mosquitoes were very bad in that area, so he probably hopped out, zipped his tent shut for a minute. He's standing there with his knife to confront whatever this is, and then he doesn't go back into his tent. Whatever was out there apparently got the best of Pat. But we can't just say he was attacked by an animal because there was no blood, there was no remains, there was no sign of a death struggle in that campground, and the food that was in his tent was untouched. No animal had tried to rip open the tent to get to the food, something that animals do after they attack people at their campsites. So the million-dollar question is, if it wasn't a wild animal that he was getting out of his tent with his knife to confront, then who or what was it? And where's Patrick? In April of 1976, 19-year-old Stephen Thomas was asked by his good friend Bruce Weaver if he wanted to join Bruce and Bruce's 4 other friends on a hike in New York State. Steve didn't know these 4 others, but he really liked Bruce and he loved hiking, so he agreed to go. The mountain they were going to climb was Mount Marcy. It's one of the biggest mountains on the East Coast, and it's very rugged, it's very windy, the temperatures drop dramatically towards the summit. It's a dangerous place unless you treat it with respect. On the morning that Steve was leaving for this hike, his mother told him that she had a bad feeling about the hike and that maybe he should just cancel because it didn't seem like a good idea to be hiking such a rugged mountain with people he didn't know. But Steve, who had a lot of experience hiking, said it was totally fine, he was eager to go, and that he would see her in a couple of days. On April 12th, 1976, the 6 men are making their way up Mount Marcy, and they get near the summit by about 3:30 p.m. in the afternoon, and even though they could have pressed on and made their way up to the summit, they were all really exhausted from the trip so far, and they decided they would make camp where they were and they would attack the summit the next day, and they were all eager to do that, with the exception of Steve. Steve didn't want to stop. Steve was sitting in Bruce's tent looking at the map of Mount Marcy, and he said to Bruce, "Hey, do you want to go for a quick walk with me? I just want to walk up the path a little ways." And Bruce was like, "No, man, I'm tired. Let's just go tomorrow." And so Steve just continued to stay up looking at this map. He made tea for himself, and at some point, he folded the map up and said, "Hey, Bruce, I'm just going to walk up the path a little ways. I'll be right back." Bruce told Steve this was a bad idea. Don't go up there on your own. The temperatures are dropping. It's getting dark. It's windy. It's just a disaster waiting to happen. Plus, we're all going to be up there first thing in the morning, so there's no reason to go up right now. But Steve was like, I just don't want to sit here. I'm going to just go. So Steve begins to walk out. The other hikers that he didn't know too well are like, "Hey, man, just stay here." But again, Steve's not listening, and Steve continues up the trail. When Steve left, he must have thought he was only going to be gone for a few minutes because he threw on a rain jacket, this yellow rain jacket, over a t-shirt and pants because he'd been sitting in a warm tent. He just threw on a jacket and he left his backpack. He just walked out with no supplies and began walking up this trail. At the time Steve was walking down that path, the snow was very hard packed, so it was easy to walk on, and there was a full moon, so there was great visibility. So it was a good night to be doing what Steve was doing, albeit if it had just been for a few minutes. So as Steve is walking away from the camp, even though the other hikers were annoyed with him, they weren't concerned. He had loads of hiking experience in Washington State. He was very eager to do this, and again, it was well lit. The snow was hard packed. They're thinking, okay, he'll be gone for a couple of minutes and then we'll see him again and it'll be just fine. After about an hour, it was dark and the temperatures are now well below freezing, and Steve has not come back yet, and he was not dressed for the sub-freezing temperatures. So the hikers walk a little ways down the path and they're yelling out for Steve, but there's no response. They decide that they have to go up the path and look for him because the conditions are going to kill him if he doesn't come back and get in his tent soon. When they go back to their tent to get some of their equipment to go make this trek to go find Steve, one of those 4 hikers that Steve did not know particularly well had brought his dog along for this hike, which apparently he always did. This dog was highly energetic, went everywhere with this guy. He loved hiking. Anytime the dog could go out and go run around, it would do it in a heartbeat. And when this hiker went in his tent to not only get his own gear, but to get his dog and bring his dog with him to go look for Steve, the dog refused to leave the tent. In fact, it cowered in the back of the tent and acted like it was scared of something that was outside of the tent. The dog's owner would tell investigators later that he's never seen his dog act that way. He was acting scared of something to the point where he would stay in the tent and all the hikers would go looking for Steve. The dog would rather be alone in a tent, totally isolated, than leave that tent. That's how scared he was of whatever it was that was out there. So the men go out looking and they can't find Steve. And after a little bit, they end up going back because it's just so dangerous to look for him in the middle of the night. So the group heads back to their tents and they're just praying that he found shelter somewhere on the mountain. The next morning, as soon as the sun came up, the hikers immediately start looking for Steve, yelling for Steve. There's no sign of him. And at some point, half the group leaves and walks the 4 hours down the trail to a vehicle where they could go drive and get authorities while the other 3 continue to look and stay near the camp just in case Steve were to return. Once authorities were notified, they launched one of the largest search and rescue efforts in the history of New York. They spent 2 weeks combing this entire mountain. Helicopters, dog teams, searchers on the ground, they are looking everywhere. There is no sign of Steve, even though he had this bright yellow jacket on. They can't find anything. He's just totally gone. After the official search was terminated after about 2 weeks, Steve's older brother, Bob, who is 26 years old, in amazing shape and very close with his brother Steve, he quits his job and moves to the Mount Marcy area and spent a whole year searching every inch of this mountain. Veteran park rangers at Mount Marcy would joke that Bob knew the mountain better than they did. Bob had apparently walked over 2,500 miles on Mount Marcy and had summited 600 times or more, and every time he would take a different route and search all along the mountain. He has looked everywhere, and he can't find his brother. Although Bob would never find his brother, he did locate the remains of a hiker who had gone missing 3 years earlier, so he was able to provide closure for that family. So why did Steve feel the need to walk up this trail in the first place? And then what was the dog so scared of after Steve vanished? Because the dog never acted that way, but suddenly something was so terrifying on the outside of their tents that it abandoned its owner and huddled in the tent in fear. And then how could Bob have missed his brother Steve, who was wearing a bright yellow jacket after combing every inch of this mountain? The only logical answer is that Steve is not on the mountain. But if he's not on the mountain, where is he? So like all of the missing 411 cases, we don't know what happened to these people, and we probably never will. But that doesn't stop us from theorizing about what could have happened to them. So get in the comments and give me your best theory about what's happening to these people. And not only will I get back to all the early commenters, I'll also pin the best comment at the top of the comment section. If you enjoyed today's story and you haven't...
On the afternoon of June 19th, 1993, a man in his late 60s was enjoying a round of golf with 3 of his friends. His name was Pete Roberts, and as he looked for his ball near the tall trees at the edge of the course, he couldn't help but smile. An emerald green fairway was spread out in front of him, lined with trees and dotted with clear blue ponds. He thought it might be the most beautiful golf course he'd ever played on, and he could play on it as often as he liked, which came in handy because Pete actually was not very good at golf and wanted to improve his game. A few years ago, Pete and his wife Nancy had moved to Fairfield Glade in eastern Tennessee. It was advertised as a retirement community, but to them it felt like a vacation resort. There were hiking trails, tennis courts, and best of all, 5 world-class golf courses, all within walking distance from their house. They'd made lots of new friends, too. Fairfield Glade was full of people just like Pete and Nancy, folks who had worked hard throughout their entire lives, and now they just wanted to enjoy life and relax. Pete carefully lined up his club and prepared to take his shot. But as he stared down at his ball nestled in the grass, he started to feel lightheaded. He staggered a bit to regain his balance, and his friends saw that something was wrong with him. So they grabbed him by the arms and shoulders, making sure he didn't fall down, and then they guided him over to the golf cart so he could sit down. As Pete sat in the cart sipping on water, he wondered if maybe he'd just gotten too much sun. Fortunately, the dizziness spell passed after only a couple of minutes, and then they all headed back to the clubhouse. A few hours later, Pete was grilling steaks out on his deck. He and Nancy had some neighbors over for dinner, as they often did on Saturdays. Pete chatted with his friends as he flipped the steaks over one by one, until the dizziness returned. On top of that, his head was starting to ache, so he carefully made his way inside and took some aspirin. But it didn't make much of a difference. During dinner, Pete barely touched his food, and he was in such a fog that he struggled to make conversation. By the time everyone went home, Pete was really feeling rough, like every muscle in his body was aching. Nancy thought he might be coming down with some kind of flu, so she sent him off to bed in the hopes that he'd sleep it off. By the time Nancy got into their bed a couple of hours later, Pete was fast asleep, but she noticed his breathing sounded unusually deep and heavy. She considered waking him up to make sure he was okay, but decided it might be better to just let him rest. She turned off the light on her bedstand, made a mental note to call Pete's doctor first thing in the morning, and then she drifted off to sleep. Just before dawn, Nancy woke up and realized that Pete's side of the bed was empty. She got up and immediately noticed a crack of light under the bathroom door. She thought Pete must have been using the toilet, but she still wanted to make sure he was okay. so she knocked softly on the door and called for her husband. But Pete didn't answer. She knocked again and waited, but again there was no reply. Nancy started to worry. She turned the knob and saw the door was unlocked. But when she tried to open the door, she realized it was blocked by something inside the bathroom. Nancy could sense that something definitely was wrong here, so she pushed even harder, but still the door wouldn't budge. And so she shoved again and again with all of her might, and the door cracked open a few inches. She kept pushing, and finally she was able to squeeze her head through the opening, and when she looked down, she could see her husband had collapsed on the bathroom floor. Nancy's heart began to pound. She summoned more strength and forced the door open enough to wriggle her whole body inside. She grabbed Pete by the shoulders, screamed his name, and splashed water on his face. He seemed to be breathing, but no matter what she did, he just would not wake up. Nancy finally ran out of the bathroom to the phone and called 911. A short time later, a little after 6 in the morning, paramedics arrived on the scene and were immediately concerned. Pete had a high fever, a dangerously fast heart rate, and his skin had a bluish tint. The medics wasted no time. They loaded Pete into the ambulance and sped to the nearest hospital. Around the same time, a doctor in his early 30s named David Stenson was in his office at the Cumberland Medical Center getting ready to pack up and go home. He had been assigned to work the overnight shift that weekend and was looking forward to grabbing a bite to eat on his way home before getting some well-earned sleep. But as he locked the door to his office, a nurse ran up and told him a new patient named Pete Roberts had arrived in the emergency room and needed Dr. Stenson's attention immediately. Dr. Stenson changed course and ran to the emergency room where he saw Pete getting rolled inside on a gurney. Dr. Stenson rushed over to examine him. Pete was still unconscious and his vital signs were at critical levels. His kidneys were failing and now he had fallen into a coma, so Dr. Stenson knew he had to act fast. The bluish tint to Pete's skin was a clear sign that his blood oxygen levels were dropping. Dr. Stenson decided that Pete needed to be put on a ventilator, which is a machine that pumps oxygen into a patient's lungs. The doctor carefully inserted a tube into Pete's mouth and carefully pushed it down his throat all the way to the bottom of his windpipe. Once the ventilator was powered up, Pete's condition immediately started to stabilize as oxygen flowed directly into his lungs. With that crisis averted, Dr. Stenson picked up a file folder and started reviewing Pete's medical history. As he flipped through the pages, Dr. Stenson couldn't see any underlying health issues that would make Pete this sick. Pete had always been a bit on the heavy side, but by and large, he was a healthy guy. There were no pre-existing conditions or red flags that the doctor could connect to Pete's current condition, but Dr. Stenson was determined to keep looking. 30 minutes later, the doctor was scanning x-rays of Pete's chest. His lungs looked like solid white blobs. This meant that they were full of fluid instead of air, which explained why Pete's oxygen levels were so low when he arrived. Dr. Stenson feared that the fluid meant Pete had a disease called spinal meningitis, which is a bacterial infection that spreads extremely fast along the spinal cord to the brain. It could kill Pete in less than 24 hours if it wasn't treated right away. Dr. Stenson rushed back to Pete's bedside. He was still unconscious, so the doctor and his team carefully rolled him onto his side. They pulled up the back of Pete's shirt, and the doctor slowly inserted a long syringe needle deep into Pete's lower back, all the way into his spinal cord. This procedure was called a spinal tap, and it enabled the doctor to extract fluid from Pete's spine so that it could be tested for meningitis or other conditions. If the fluid came out of Pete looking clear, that meant Pete did not have spinal meningitis. But if the fluid looked yellow and cloudy like lemonade, it was a sure sign Pete did have it. Dr. Stenson held his breath as he extracted the spinal fluid into the syringe. And when he looked at it, it was totally clear and had no color. The doctor let out a sigh of relief. Pete did not have spinal meningitis. But there was no time to relax. Pete was still in critical condition, and Dr. Stenson had to keep searching for answers. It wasn't until the afternoon, 8 hours after Pete's arrival, that a clue started to emerge. While Dr. Stenson reviewed the results of a blood test, he saw that Pete's white blood cell count was much lower than it should have been. The results surprised Dr. Stenson. Normally, white blood cell counts were elevated when someone was fighting an infection, but in rare cases, certain infections could also decrease someone's white blood cell count. That was helpful information, but Dr. Stenson still had no clue as to what was causing this infection. As the hours passed later into the evening, Dr. Stenson felt stumped and totally exhausted. He couldn't help but wonder if his hospital just was not equipped to deal with a case like Pete's. It had been over 24 hours since Dr. Stenson had last slept, but even though Pete was stable for now, Dr. Stenson didn't want to go home. So, a little after midnight, he kicked off his shoes, laid down on the couch in his office, and tried to get some rest. He hoped that once he got a little sleep, Pete's condition would start to make more sense to him. But when the doctor woke up early the next morning, things only got stranger. While grabbing a cup of coffee in the break room, Dr. Stenson learned from one of the nurses that another patient had just arrived in the emergency room. His name was Tom Parkin, and he also lived in Fairfield Glade, the retirement community where Pete was from. Tom was so sick that he could barely walk, and his symptoms were identical to Pete's. Tom's white blood cell count was low, and there was fluid building in his lungs. What's more, just like Pete, Tom's medical record showed that he was healthy with no pre-existing conditions that could explain this new illness. Over the coming days, Dr. Stenson ordered additional blood tests on both patients, combing through the results as he tried to figure out what was infecting both of them. But then, on Saturday, June 26th, 6 days after Pete arrived at the hospital, the crisis escalated again. 2 more men from Fairfield Glade arrived at the emergency room, and they too had the same symptoms as Pete and Tom. One of the new patients was in critical condition. The hospital staff did their best to stabilize him, but just a few hours after arriving, he slipped into a coma. Now, Dr. Stenson and his team had a new understanding of how quickly this mystery illness could escalate. But even though this emergency was growing, the doctor started to feel a glimmer of hope. Earlier that morning, he had received the results from a blood test he ordered the day before, and it revealed what the patient's white blood cells had been fighting. It was a bacterial infection called ehrlichiosis that coursed through the bloodstreams of its victims and wreaked havoc on their immune systems. On one hand, this was good information to have, but on the other hand, it created more questions for Dr. Stenson. Ehrlichiosis was extremely rare. The first known case of it had been reported just 6 years earlier, and only around 60 cases had been reported in the entire United States during the previous year. But here, in this tiny retirement community of just 3,000 people, 4 cases had emerged in less than a week. To Dr. Stenson, what was happening in Fairfield Glade seemed statistically impossible. Thankfully, Dr. Stenson learned that the disease could be treated with an antibiotic called tetracycline. He administered it to all 4 of the ehrlichiosis patients, and it didn't take long for them all to get better. But Fairfield Glade was still in significant danger. Ehrlichiosis was extremely dangerous and progressed at a rapid pace. Dr. Stenson knew that if he couldn't figure out what had caused this outbreak and stop it from spreading, that people were surely going to die. So he made a call to Atlanta, to the headquarters of the Center for Disease Control, and requested their assistance. The CDC agreed with Dr. Stenson's assessment and quickly put together a team led by one of the nation's greatest experts on ehrlichiosis, Dr. Reed Gerhardt. Over the next few weeks, Dr. Gerhardt and his team made 10 trips to Fairfield Glade. They studied the area and interviewed residents, they collected samples, and ran extensive tests across the community, both indoors and outdoors. And sure enough, they found the bacteria that causes ehrlichiosis was present in the environment, but only in highly remote areas. Dr. Gerhardt still didn't know why so many people were coming in contact with this bacteria or how to stop it. As Dr. Gerhardt and his team were working through the data, the epidemic was spreading. By the end of the summer, 2 months after Pete Roberts was hospitalized, 7 more ehrlichiosis cases had been diagnosed in Fairfield Glade. And so now Dr. Stenson was treating 11 different people for this illness, and he couldn't help but notice that they were all connected by another quality. All of them, except for one, were men. The ehrlichiosis crisis continued to intensify. Dr. Gerhardt and his team were unable to find a clear answer in the data they had collected over the previous weeks, so the doctor decided to review older research. He dug through every medical journal he could find, looking for possibilities, but found nothing. And then one day, he happened across a battered, yellowed copy of the New York State Journal of Medicine from 1947. It was nearly half a century old, but as he scanned through one of the articles, he stumbled onto something that was very interesting. Moments later, he was on the phone talking to Pete Roberts, the very first resident of Fairfield Glade to get hit with this disease. Dr. Gerhardt had just one question, and it was not about any of Pete's symptoms. It was about Pete's golf game. What Dr. Gerhardt learned in that phone conversation finally cracked the case wide open. Because Dr. Gerhardt was not just an expert on ehrlichiosis, he was also an expert on bugs. And Dr. Gerhardt knew that ehrlichiosis was spread by one bug in particular. When he'd first arrived at Fairfield Glade, Dr. Gerhardt had set to work figuring out where that bug was hiding. The community was bordered on one side by an 80,000-acre nature preserve with miles of walking paths. The preserve featured dense woods that were full of deer, raccoons, bears, and bugs, including the bug that he knew was the culprit. Before that phone call with Pete, Dr. Gerhardt hadn't understood how that bug could be causing this outbreak. For people to get bitten by this bug, they would need to trek off the well-groomed trails and into the bushes and grass where the bug was hiding. From what he was observing, the senior residents of Fairfield Glade were not doing that. But then, as the summer wore on, Dr. Gerhardt discovered yet another connection between all the ehrlichiosis patients. Almost all of them were golfers. And after his phone call with Pete Roberts, he finally understood these golfers were bonded by yet another critical factor, one that explained everything. When they teed off, these golfers had a very hard time centering the club as they swung it down to drive the ball down the fairway. Instead of soaring the ball in the direction of the hole, the ball would shoot diagonally off of their clubs and bounce off into the rough, which is the tall grass that surrounds the main part of the course. In warmer months, these golfers would often be wearing shorts, so when they marched into that tall grass to find their errant ball, their bare legs were easy prey for this bug that was lurking there. A bug called the Lone Star tick. This tick got its name because the adult ticks have a tiny white spot on their backs that's sort of shaped like a star. These ticks were very small, only 1 to 3 millimeters wide. They were so tiny, in fact, that the golfers felt nothing when the bugs bit down on their legs and started drinking their blood. But then it was too late. The ehrlichiosis bacteria the ticks were carrying entered the golfers' bloodstreams and started waging war on their immune systems. The 1947 journal article that Dr. Gerhardt found was written almost 40 years before the first known case of ehrlichiosis. But the article was relevant to the doctor because it talked about how other tick-borne illnesses were spread. What caught the doctor's attention was that the article concluded that tick-borne disease was a risk for golfers, but it was a much greater risk for bad golfers because they often would have to trek off into the rough. This was what the patients at the Cumberland Medical Center all had in common. Their golf scores were terrible, and all of them were spending way too much time out in the rough with the Lone Star tick. All 11 of Dr. Stenson's patients who were stricken with ehrlichiosis eventually recovered from their symptoms. With the cause of the infection now identified, Dr. Gerhardt set out to reduce the spread of the disease at Fairfield Glade. The number one prey of the ticks were the deer that resided in the surrounding nature preserve. So Dr. Gerhardt and his team developed a method of lacing corn with ivermectin, which is a drug that kills parasites. The deer that ate this corn were totally unaffected by the drug, but the ticks that drank the blood of those deer were all killed. Within months, the tick population in Fairfield Glade plummeted by 85%. Still, to this day, golfers at Fairfield Glade know to put on a healthy layer of bug spray before hitting the links, especially those with a weak game. Here is our second story called The Stranger. On a summer afternoon in 2014, a 78-year-old man named Leo hobbled up the steps to his apartment in the city of Tours, which is in central France. It was a humid day, and Leo was eager to get inside and take a nap. But the moment he opened his front door, something just felt wrong. Leo couldn't quite describe it. Everything in his apartment was exactly as he left it, but there was almost a presence in the place, like he wasn't alone. He called out, asking who was there, but nobody answered. He did have an adult daughter named Colette who lived nearby, and she did have a key, but he knew she would not come over without calling first. As quietly as possible, Leo picked up the cane that he left in an umbrella stand by the door. He raised it over his shoulders, ready to strike anyone who might lunge at him. And just the thought of doing that made his heart start to race. He was an old man. He could barely keep the cane from wobbling as he held it in the air, and so he wasn't sure how well he'd do defending himself against an intruder. Leo quietly reached down and put his hand on the entryway closet and quickly swung it open. But the closet looked undisturbed. Leo closed the door, then scanned the living room and kitchen, but they were empty too. And then when he went into his bedroom, it was still dark and totally untouched, and there was no one hiding behind the doors or under his bed. He told himself that he had to be alone, but somewhere in the back of his mind, he just didn't feel right. He just couldn't shake this feeling that there was somebody else in this apartment. Leo set his cane back into the umbrella stand, and then he headed to the bathroom to wash up, hoping that maybe some cold water on his face would get him to stop feeling so on edge. Leo opened the door, he flicked on the light, and then immediately he cried out in alarm. Because there, just a few feet away from him in the bathroom, was a grown man with cold eyes and a brooding look on his face. Leo stumbled backwards into the hallway with his back flat against the wall, and while he was there, he just stared at the stranger. He was old, with a weather-worn face and gnarled hands. His back was slightly curved, but Leo could tell from the man's wide shoulders that he still had a lot of strength left in him. "Who are you?" Leo stammered, but the stranger didn't say. Instead, he only promised not to hurt Leo. Leo could hear the sound of his own heart thumping in his ears. He knew there was a phone on the counter in the kitchen just a few feet away, and so he had to reach it. Slowly, Leo inched towards the phone, never taking his eyes off the strange man in the bathroom. But the stranger suddenly barked at Leo to stop, and Leo froze against the wall, his eyes still fixed on the stranger. The stranger begged Leo not to call the police, and at that moment, Leo saw a shift in the old man's eyes, from sort of cold to now pleading. And Leo started to get the feeling that whoever this guy was, he really didn't mean any harm. Maybe he just got lost and was confused about how he got here or where he was supposed to be. So Leo decided he would not call the police. He tried to coax the stranger out of the bathroom by inviting him into the living room, but Leo could immediately see a spike of panic in the old man's eyes. He kept saying, No, I'm fine right here, I'm fine right here. So Leo told him, okay, that's fine, don't worry about it. Leo just wanted to keep the stranger calm while he figured out what was even going on here. And so with his eyes on the stranger, Leo slowly continued backing his way down the hallway with his back to the wall, and as he did, he felt around with his lead hand until his hands found one of the lightweight wooden chairs in the kitchen. He grabbed it, again his eyes still fixed on the stranger, and then he dragged the chair back down the hallway until it was in front of the bathroom, and then he put the chair right down in front of the door, and then he looked at the stranger who was in the bathroom, and he told him to take a seat on the closed toilet lid. And to Leo's relief, right as Leo sat down, the stranger did too, and so suddenly the whole situation felt much more diffused. Leo then asked the stranger a few questions, like how long he'd lived in tours and whether he had a career when he was younger. And to Leo's surprise, the man opened up, telling Leo all about his childhood and his love of cooking. Leo told the man that he too liked to cook, and right away the stranger's eyes lit up. He launched into an explanation of all of his favorite recipes, telling Leo about his special tricks to get each one just right. Leo had to admit that he actually found talking to this old man very pleasant. For a moment, he almost forgot that this man had broken into his apartment. Then, a loud car horn sounded outside the window, snapping Leo to his senses. He realized the afternoon was growing late, and he really needed to get this stranger out of the apartment and back to wherever he belonged. He asked the stranger if anybody was expecting him for dinner that night. But for the first time, the stranger just didn't respond. His eyes filled with sorrow. Finally, he admitted to Leo that no, he and his wife had long since divorced, and nobody expected him for dinner these days. Leo frowned. He knew how the man felt. His own daughter was grown up and out of the house. It got lonely cooking for one so often. Leo sighed, and against his better judgment, he actually asked the stranger if he'd like to stay for dinner.
And right away, the stranger's face brightened and he said, "Yes, I'd love to," and he thanked Leo repeatedly. And then Leo asked if he'd like to help make dinner since he loved cooking so much. But the stranger became agitated and repeated that, "I really feel more comfortable in the bathroom, so I'm going to stay here." Leo said, "Okay, yeah, no big deal, that's fine, you can stay here." But secretly, Leo felt very unsettled by this. Why didn't he want to leave the bathroom? It didn't make any sense. Is this guy really okay? Is he mentally unwell? Like, what's going on here? And it was at this point that the reality of the situation that Leo was in really came back to him. I mean, there is a stranger who broke into your house who will not leave the bathroom. And Leo had no idea what the stranger was even capable of, and he's just now invited him to dinner. But without much else to do, Leo simply said, "Okay, I'm going to go make dinner now," and he left the hallway and headed to the kitchen, and he busied himself making a brie and tomato tart, but the whole time he never allowed himself to fully turn his back to the bathroom. He wanted to make sure at all times he at least had some line of sight on where the stranger was. But the whole time Leo was in the kitchen staring at the bathroom, the stranger never left the bathroom. He couldn't even see the stranger anymore. And then anytime Leo walked over to the bathroom and peeked his head in, he would see the stranger just standing there next to the sink, not doing anything. 40 minutes later, Leo served dinner in the bathroom because the stranger, again, would not leave the bathroom. As for the stranger, when he received the food, he acted like this was totally normal. And if Leo was being honest with himself, he was kind of glad to have this guy here. He liked having the company, even if the company was pretty odd. And so the two men chatted and had their meal together, and then after they were done, Leo was pretty tired and ready for bed, and so as gently as he could, he told the stranger that it was now time for him to leave. But the stranger refused and said, "Nope, I feel good in the bathroom, I'm going to stay here." Now Leo was starting to get frustrated, and he said, "No, really, you have to leave right now." But again, the stranger, just as calm as can be, said, "Nope, I'm going to stay here." Finally, Leo just got mad and practically yelled at this guy to get out of the house now, but the stranger grabbed onto the sink, adamant that he would not go, and he told Leo, "This is my home, I'm staying here." Leo was totally outraged. He had been nothing but kind to this man, and now his patience was totally gone. But when he shouted yet again at this man to get out, the stranger's eyes suddenly went cold. That brooding face returned, and he became aggressive. The stranger shouted that this was his apartment and he was not going anywhere, and he began to pace back and forth beside the tub, warning Leo to leave him alone or else. It was at this point that Leo realized he could not solve this by himself, but he still felt bad about calling the police. He was convinced this stranger was just confused. Leo didn't think he deserved to be arrested. So Leo just started slowly backing away down the hallway away from the bathroom, keeping his eyes fixed on the bathroom in case this guy came running out. And then eventually, Leo reached the kitchen where he was able to reach his phone, and he grabbed the receiver and dialed the number for his daughter, Colette. And then when she picked up, he told her everything that was going on, and she told him she would be there as fast as she could. A few minutes later, Colette was parked outside of her father's apartment. She bounded up the stairs and flung open the front door, and her eyes landed on her father, Leo, who was pacing in the living room looking totally upset, and Leo would say that the elderly stranger was in the bathroom. But when Colette checked, the bathroom was empty. Colette moved quickly from room to room looking for the stranger, but there was no sign of him. She figured he must have fled her father's apartment in the short time it took for her to drive over here. So Colette rejoined her dad in the living room and tried to calm him down, telling him that, the stranger must have left and they'd just changed the locks in the morning and everything would be fine. But Leo still seemed really upset, and he just kept pacing around in the living room. To Colette, it seemed like her dad wasn't even listening to her. She put her hands on his shoulders and forced him to stand still, and slowly his eyes did focus on her and his shoulders relaxed. But while Leo did seem to now be more calm, when he began to speak again, Colette became very worried, because her father was talking about the stranger and how upsetting it was that they were here. However, what he was really upset about was actually the stranger's manners, not the fact that the stranger had broken into his apartment. Leo kept saying, how rude it was for someone not to leave when they were asked to leave. And Colette kept telling her dad, that doesn't really matter. He's gone now, and that's the most important thing. Remember, he broke into your house. This is someone who probably is not very polite. But Leo, he just could not let go of how rude this stranger was. And so slowly, as Colette listened to her dad rant about the stranger's poor manners, something about the story just started to feel wrong. Like the way her dad was talking about it just didn't seem like a normal reaction to what had just happened. And so acting on impulse, she grabbed her dad's jacket and ushered her dad to the door and told him they were going to the hospital to make sure he was okay. A few hours later, Colette sat down next to her father's bed inside of the emergency room. It was after midnight, and the doctors had run a full course of tests, including blood work and an MRI. They also had given Leo cognitive and memory tests, and now Colette and Leo were anxiously waiting for the results. Finally, a physician parted the curtains by the bed and walked into the room, and he told Leo that physically, he was basically fine. All of his tests were normal, except for a small damaged area near the base of his brain where a little pocket of connective tissue was missing. The doctor told them that it could be a sign that Leo had early-stage Alzheimer's disease, which causes the loss of memory and cognitive function. Colette felt the blood drain from her face. Alzheimer's is a fatal disease, and she wasn't ready to lose her father to it. But the doctor assured her that it was still too early to know for sure if he had it, and even if he did, the doctor said treatment options now were better than ever. Just in case, the doctor said he was prescribing Leo 2 anti-anxiety medications that are frequently used to treat the symptoms of Alzheimer's. And the doctor said he would keep Leo in the hospital overnight just to make sure he was okay. Moments later, a nurse entered the room with a small water bottle and a little plastic cup with 2 white pills inside of it. After Leo swallowed both pills, it didn't take long for him to relax. Leo promised Colette that he'd be totally fine at the hospital by himself, and she should just come back in the morning. So Colette thanked him and kissed him on the cheek, and then she headed home to get some sleep as well. The following morning, Colette headed back to the hospital, and Leo had just been discharged, and so she was able to collect him and get him out to her car, and then she drove him back to his apartment. And when they got to the door and they opened it up, Leo very cautiously stepped inside, and for a second he tried to see if he had that same feeling he got the day before, when he felt like there was somebody in the apartment, and sure enough there was. But as Leo stood there right now, he didn't get that feeling. The apartment felt empty. But Leo still felt like he just had to check the bathroom. And so with Colette right behind him, Leo slowly made his way to the bathroom, he opened up the door, he looked inside, and he sighed with relief. The stranger was gone. A few days later, when Colette and Leo returned to the hospital for a follow-up visit, when they went into the exam room, the doctor came in and told Leo that he had some news. They had discovered something that explained why that stranger was in Leo's house. The doctor told Leo that he was suffering from a neurological condition called Cagras syndrome, which prevents people from recognizing familiar faces. Leo thought a stranger was in his bathroom, when in reality, it was actually someone he knew very well. The doctor admitted that he had never seen a case like Leo's, where he could recognize all the people around him except for this one particular person. The doctor said that maybe the combination of Cagras syndrome and early-stage Alzheimer's contributed to Leo becoming so confused about who was in his apartment the night he came to the hospital. But before the doctor could even finish, Leo said he did now recognize the stranger for who he was all along. Leo's own face in the bathroom mirror.